One meal a day is best for longevity because it leads to less mTOR and insulin spikes.
So yeah, so I mean that's a common, I think, perception, at least among certain parts of the longevity community, and really this I think stems from some of the literature on intermittent fasting. So again, I think always when we talk about nutrition and nutritional interventions, it's really important when we think about the data to differentiate between, what we know from humans and what we know from studies in laboratory animals. And in particular, in the case of dietary interventions, most of those studies are going to be in laboratory rodents, usually in mice, sometimes in rats. So I think this really, the evidence to support the idea that one meal a day or intermittent fasting is a pro-longevity intervention really comes only from studies in laboratory animals. And what we know there is that intermittent fasting, which I'm going to define as at least 24 hours of fasting, so more than a day, is associated with increased lifespan in mice, but really only when you also have a reduction in calories. And what I mean by that is that on the days where the mice aren't fasting, they don't make up for the fasting days. So the question I think that remains even in the mouse studies is the lifespan benefit there coming from caloric restriction, or is it coming from intermittent fasting? Now, you asked specifically about one meal a day, so I would define that as time-restricted feeding, where we just shorten the window of time to, whatever length of time it takes to eat one meal a day if you're eating every day. We really don't have much data in laboratory animals to support the idea that time-restricted feeding has a big effect on longevity, or really any effect on longevity. Certainly no evidence independent of caloric restriction. So that comes from the laboratory studies. In humans, it's really hard to make any claims around longevity from a nutritional intervention in humans, but I really don't know of any evidence that would cause me to think that as sort of a one-size-fits-all solution, one meal a day is a pro-longevity strategy. And there is this perception that has been sort of, amplified by uninformed influencers that that's been shown, and it just hasn't. And that, I think, is where the disconnect comes in.
Like autophagy comes to mind is what people think.
Well, so autophagy is a biological process that gets induced by inhibition of mTOR. And if you fast long enough, you will induce autophagy. I think and there's some reason to believe that's beneficial in certain contexts. The question, though, is if you intermittent fast long enough to induce autophagy, let's say you fast for 48 hours, but you don't caloric restrict, so you eat twice as much the next day, or is the detriment from doing that going to offset any benefits you might have gotten from autophagy? So is it the autophagy? Is it the caloric restriction? Is it the overall context that matters, right? And that's where I think there's this disconnect that, the idea that just increasing autophagy in and of itself, if everything else is equal, is going to give you some health benefit, that really hasn't been shown. I've been pretty vocal that I think from a longevity perspective, the evidence that intermittent fasting or time-restricted feeding is a longevity strategy per se is pretty much non-existent, independent of the caloric restriction. But I think as a tool, especially for people who are trying to maintain a healthy body weight, those can be very powerful sort of strategies. So in your case,
I would say, this is all a weird, what is intermittent fasting? For me, caloric restriction was key, and actually fasting was really what kind of kick-started me into thinking about food differently.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what, when George first said, hey, I want you to, not eat for 24 hours, twice a week. What, are you out of your mind? Like literally the reaction was, are you out of your mind? My family and people around me like, oh my God, what are you going to do? And it was kind of rough. I mean, the first couple days, but what I also did during that time is I had CGM on. I also got a Keto Mojo monitor. So I look at ketones and glucose in my blood and was able to see the different things.
So you had some real-time feedback that this is doing something.
You bet.
Yeah.
And it's definitely affecting. And, what was interesting is, going back to blood work is like getting cramps, right? Okay, I'm fasting for, and I don't think I've done a fast more than 48 hours. I'm not an advocate of, 48 hour, 40 days or 7 days. I mean, I've never gone to that extreme. But after a couple, kind of cramping, it's like, well, why is that? It's like, well, how's my magnesium? How's my potassium? Well, I'm drinking lots of fluid. Well, I've just flushed all the electrolytes out of my body. but I'm fairly confident that I did shock my system a bit over time. It wasn't like, look, you're going to fast on Tuesday and on Friday you're great.
Yeah.
Like this is about, spend 30 days, take a baseline, spend 30 days, and then what happened?
And from a health span perspective, there's really not much evidence that this sort of time-restricted feeding has big benefits on health span. Maybe small metabolic benefits, but even there, I would say it's not very convincing. So I would say you really have to be able to not just look at the headlines, but actually get into the meat of the science in order to be able to really evaluate, some of the claims that are made. I would say the same thing's true for intermittent fasting as well. And by that, in mice, we typically would define intermittent fasting as fasting the animals for more than 24 hours. I think we may have touched on this in the prior episode. But, again, once you control for calorie consumption, the benefits of intermittent fasting pretty much go away, even in mouse models. So it's really not so clear whether that's a caloric restriction effect versus a fasting effect. And I'm not trying to say there are no benefits from fasting or time-restricted feeding. Again, I think they can be useful strategies for some people to maintain a healthy body weight and to help with sort of overall dietary goals. But from a longevity perspective, again, I'm really not convinced